In the heart of Manhattan, towering above the bustling streets, Sterling Enterprises symbolizes power and success. Its CEO, Marlon Sterling, is at the helm of this empire, a man who built his fortune through sheer determination and unyielding ambition. At 32, he commands respect wherever he goes. People admire his brilliance but fear his temper. While Marlon is known for his ruthless approach to business, few know the emotional turmoil that lurks beneath his cold exterior. Enter Elizabeth Anderson, a woman who once worked as his assistant. Unlike the other employees who walked on eggshells around him, Elizabeth had a warmth and sincerity that drew Marlon in. She was not intimidated by his power, nor did she treat him like a distant, untouchable figure. Their relationship started with casual conversations, late nights spent working, and eventually, a powerful connection that neither of them could deny. Behind closed doors, they shared a romance that was both passionate and fragile. But while Elizabeth gave Marlon her heart, his inability to let down his emotional guard slowly created a rift between them. Marlon's fear of vulnerability came from his childhood, where betrayal and loss shaped his outlook on love. He always kept control of every situation in his life: his company, his employees, his business deals. But when it came to love, he faltered. Elizabeth, though patient, grew weary of the walls Marlon constantly kept up. For every tender moment they shared, there were times when Marlon's coldness left her feeling abandoned. His intense need for control in their relationship made her feel suffocated. She loved him deeply, but Marlon's emotional distance and unwillingness to fully commit became unbearable. One night, after yet another argument about Marlon's emotional unavailability, Elizabeth knew she had reached her limit. She couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in a relationship where love was present but always out of reach. It was tearing her apart. With a heavy heart, Elizabeth made the painful decision to leave. She packed her bags in the dead of night, trying to fight back tears. She left behind a single note on Marlon's desk, the words reflecting the depth of her sorrow: "I love you, but I can't stay. Goodbye." When Marlon returned the next morning, he found the note. His eyes scanned the words, but instead of feeling sadness, he was consumed with fury. He crumpled the paper in his hand, refusing to accept the truth. To him, this was another betrayal, someone else walking out of his life just when he thought he could trust them. After Elizabeth's sudden departure, Marlon's rage grew unchecked. He couldn't comprehend why she had left him. In his mind, they had everything: power, status, and a deep connection that few others could understand. How could she simply walk away? His heart hardened, and the bitterness festered. Rather than face the pain of losing her, Marlon channeled his emotions into his work, becoming even more ruthless than before. Marlon's transformation was swift and terrifying. Where he was once tough but fair, he now became a merciless figure in the business world. Employees feared him more than ever. Board meetings became battlegrounds where Marlon crushed anyone who dared question his authority. The empire he had built only expanded as his drive for success became insatiable. His new motto? Never be vulnerable again. Despite his growing fortune and power, Marlon's mind kept returning to Elizabeth. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she fought for their relationship? He couldn't let it go. Using his wealth and influence, he hired private investigators to find her, desperate for answers. Months passed with no sign of her. She had disappeared completely, leaving no trace. Marlon's frustration mounted. His mind played tricks on him, replaying their last moments together, wondering if he had missed something that could have made her stay. His desire for revenge grew. He convinced himself that Elizabeth had only been with him for the security and lifestyle he offered, just like everyone else in his life. His trust in people shattered. The softer side of Marlon that Elizabeth had once seen was buried under layers of anger and regret. He vowed to never let anyone close again. Marlon's obsession with Elizabeth consumed him privately. While his professional life soared, his personal life crumbled. He distanced himself from friends, from any semblance of personal joy. At night, in the quiet solitude of his penthouse, he drank alone, trying to numb the pain he refused to acknowledge. The image of Elizabeth haunted him. Her laughter, her touch, the way she would look at him as if he were the only man in the world. But every memory brought with it a wave of bitterness. He couldn't forgive her for leaving, and yet he couldn't forget her. The more he tried to push the memories away, the more they clawed at him. 8 years passed, and Elizabeth had rebuilt her life far from Marlon's shadow. She had moved to a quieter part of New York and started her own interior design business. She had changed her name to avoid being found by anyone connected to Marlon, and more importantly, she had a new purpose in life: her son, Ethan. Ethan, now 6 years old, was the spitting image of Marlon. His deep brown eyes, his sharp features, and his intense gaze reminded Elizabeth every day of the life she had left behind. But despite his resemblance to his father, Ethan had Elizabeth's warmth and gentle spirit. He was a kind, curious child, and Elizabeth's entire world revolved around him. She had chosen to raise him alone, fearing the consequences if Marlon ever found out he had a son. Elizabeth had grown stronger over the years. She was no longer the vulnerable girl who had fallen for Marlon's charm. She was a successful businesswoman, independent and resilient. But her past with Marlon remained a secret she carried with her daily. Ethan had started asking questions about his father, and each time, Elizabeth struggled with how much to reveal. How could she explain to a child that his father was a man who had once broken her heart and controlled her life? Still, Elizabeth had no regrets about keeping Ethan away from Marlon's world. She knew the kind of man Marlon had become: cold, ruthless, and dangerous. She would protect Ethan at all costs, even if it meant living in fear of being discovered. One crisp autumn day, Elizabeth received a new client request: a prestigious company in need of a complete redesign of their headquarters. Excited by the prospect of such a high-profile project, she eagerly accepted the job, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. As she walked into the gleaming glass doors of Sterling Enterprises, her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized until that very moment whose company she was walking into. The memories of Marlon came flooding back, but she told herself she could handle it. This was business, and she was a professional now. She would complete the project and leave. Marlon, unaware that Elizabeth had returned to his orbit, had thrown himself into another day of meetings. But when he stepped into the design presentation for his company's office renovation, his world came crashing down. Standing before him was Elizabeth, the woman who had walked out of his life 8 years ago. For a moment, time stood still. Marlon's usually unreadable expression faltered, his eyes widening in shock. His heart pounded in his chest. How was she here? Why now? A mix of emotions surged through him: anger, longing, and disbelief. Elizabeth, too, was frozen in place, her eyes locked on Marlon's. She had prepared herself for the possibility of seeing him, but nothing could have truly braced her for this moment. The air between them was electric, charged with years of unresolved tension. Marlon, regaining his composure, was the first to speak. His voice was low, but the sharp edge of his words couldn't be mistaken. Marlon, Elizabeth, what an unexpected surprise. Elizabeth met his gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. Elizabeth, it's business, Marlon, nothing more. But both of them knew it wasn't that simple. Beneath their icy exchange was a hurricane of emotions waiting to be unleashed. Marlon was not the kind of man to let things go, especially not when it came to Elizabeth. And as much as Elizabeth wanted to keep things professional, the storm brewing between them was far from over. Elizabeth left the meeting at Sterling Enterprises with her heart racing. The moment she had dreaded for 8 years had come to pass. She had come face to face with Marlon Sterling again. Every step she took away from that building felt heavier than the last. How was it possible that after all this time, her emotions could still be so conflicted? She had convinced herself that she no longer cared, that she had moved on. But seeing him again stirred up feelings she had long tried to suppress: pain, anger, and, despite it all, an undeniable pull toward the man who had once captured her heart. Marlon, on the other hand, sat in his office, staring blankly at the glass windows that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. The sight of Elizabeth had knocked the wind out of him. He had thought she was gone forever, but here she was, standing in his office as if fate had twisted the knife. Anger coursed through his veins. How could she just show up after disappearing without a trace? Marlon's mind raced, but one thing was clear. He needed answers. He wouldn't let her walk out of his life again without a confrontation. When Elizabeth returned home, she was greeted by the sight of Ethan playing in the living room, his laughter filling the air. She paused at the door, watching him for a moment, her heart swelling with love. He was her world now, and everything she did was for him. But how would she shield him from Marlon, now that they had crossed paths again? As she sat down to dinner with Ethan that evening, her thoughts were distracted. Ethan, ever observant, noticed. "Mommy, are you okay?" Elizabeth smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his face. "Elizabeth, I'm fine, sweetie. Just a busy day at work." But deep down, she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. She couldn't hide from Marlon forever, especially now that they were back in each other's world. And the terrifying question loomed. What would happen when Marlon found out about Ethan? A few days later, Elizabeth received a call from Sterling Enterprises. It was a formal request for a follow-up meeting regarding the design project. Elizabeth knew this was coming. She steeled herself, telling herself that this was strictly business and she would handle it professionally. But when she arrived at Marlon's office, it was clear that this was not going to be a normal meeting. Marlon sat behind his desk, his dark eyes fixed on her as she entered. There was a coldness to his expression, but beneath it was something else, something far more dangerous. Without preamble, he stood and walked toward her, stopping only inches away. "You left without saying goodbye. Why?" Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. This was the conversation she had avoided for 8 long years, and now it was staring her in the face. But she couldn't allow herself to crumble under his gaze. "I had my reasons, Marlon. I needed space." His jaw clenched, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Space? You disappeared. No calls, no explanation, nothing. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Elizabeth met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You don't understand," but Marlon cut her off. "No, Elizabeth, you don't understand. You can't just walk back into my life as if nothing happened. We're going to have this out, whether you like it or not." Elizabeth felt the pressure building, the weight of the secrets she had been carrying for so long threatening to crush her. But this wasn't the time to tell Marlon about Ethan. Not yet. She couldn't risk him knowing until she understood what kind of man he had become. Instead, she squared her shoulders and faced him head-on. "I did what I had to do, Marlon. I'm not here to dredge up the past. I'm here to do my job. Let's keep it professional." Marlon's eyes narrowed, his frustration palpable. But Elizabeth turned on her heel and walked out of the office before he could say another word. Marlon watched her go, his hands clenched into fists. The more she pulled away, the more determined he became. He wasn't going to let her escape again. Not this time. Marlon couldn't shake the image of Elizabeth from his mind. The anger he felt at her betrayal was undeniable, but so too was the yearning that had never fully gone away. Seeing her again had awakened a torrent of emotions he had buried long ago. He hated that she still had this power over him, hated that despite everything, he still wanted her. Late at night, Marlon found himself standing on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below him. He thought back to their time together, to the moments when Elizabeth had been the one person who made him feel like he didn't have to be the ruthless CEO everyone expected him to be. With her, he had been able to let his guard down, until she had shattered that trust. But why? What had driven her to leave without a word? Marlon knew he needed answers, but more than that, he needed to understand why, after all these years, he still cared so much. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was struggling with her own emotions. Seeing Marlon again had brought back memories she had tried so hard to forget. Despite the hurt, there had been good times. Moments when she had felt truly loved by him. But those moments had been overshadowed by his inability to open up, to fully commit. That was why she had left, to protect herself from further pain. But now, with Ethan in the picture, things were even more complicated. As she sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, watching him sleep, she wondered if she had made the right decision all those years ago. Had she been too hasty in leaving? Should she have fought harder for their relationship? But no. Marlon had never shown her that he was willing to let her in, not completely. She had to remind herself of that. Still, the what-ifs lingered. As the weeks passed, Marlon couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to Elizabeth's disappearance than she was letting on. She had always been honest with him before, so why was she being so evasive now? He started digging into her life, using his resources to gather information. What he found shocked him. Through his private investigator, Marlon discovered that Elizabeth had a son, Ethan, a 6-year-old boy. Marlon's mind reeled as he stared at the report in front of him. The timeline added up too perfectly. Ethan was born just months after Elizabeth had left him. Could it be? Could Ethan be his son? The realization hit him, like a freight train. If Ethan was his, that meant Elizabeth had been hiding him for all these years. Rage boiled up inside Marlon, but beneath it was something else, something far more profound. He had a son. He had been a father for 6 years, and Elizabeth had kept that from him. Marlon wasted no time. The very next day, he stormed into Elizabeth's office. His face was a mask of fury as he shut the door behind him. "You have a son, Ethan." Elizabeth froze, her heart stopping for a moment. She knew this day would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of Marlon's anger. "Marlon, I can explain," but he wasn't listening. "He's mine, isn't he? You kept my son from me for 6 years." Elizabeth felt the weight of the truth crashing down around her. There was no more hiding, no more evading. She had to face the consequences of her decision to leave Marlon behind. "Yes, he's your son." Marlon's expression shifted from fury to disbelief. He backed away slightly, as if the truth was too much to bear. For 6 years, he had lived without knowing he had a child, and now that he did, everything had changed. "Marlon, you had no right to keep him from me." "I did what I thought was best, Marlon. I wasn't sure if you could handle being a father. You weren't ready then." The room was thick with tension, but this was only the beginning. Now that the truth was out, their lives were about to collide in ways neither of them could have anticipated. After the revelation, Marlon could barely think straight. His mind was consumed with the fact that he had missed 6 years of his son's life. He had always prided himself on being in control, both in his personal life and as the head of Sterling Enterprises. But this shook him to his core. He had a son, a boy he hadn't known existed. How could Elizabeth have hidden such a monumental truth from him? That night, Marlon couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring out into the city. His thoughts swirled with a mixture of anger, regret, and a fierce need to be a part of Ethan's life. There was no way he would allow Elizabeth to keep him away from his son now. Ethan was his, and Marlon was determined to be the father the boy deserved. The next morning, Marlon met with his legal team. "I want full custody of my son. I want him to live with me." The lawyers exchanged glances. One of them, Jameson, cleared his throat. "Jameson, Marlon, I understand that you're upset, but family courts typically favor the mother, especially if the child has been with her for years. We could look into shared custody, but full custody could be challenging." Marlon's jaw clenched. The idea of sharing Ethan with Elizabeth, after everything she had done, infuriated him. "I don't care what it takes. Make it happen." Meanwhile, Elizabeth was reeling from Marlon's discovery. She had known that once Marlon found out about Ethan, her life would change, but she hadn't anticipated how fast everything would spiral. The Marlon she knew was calculating, determined, and relentless. He wouldn't back down from this fight. And while she had tried to protect Ethan all these years, she couldn't keep him from his father any longer. That night, as Elizabeth tucked Ethan into bed, she sat on the edge of his bed, stroking his hair. "Mommy, are you okay? You've been sad lately." Elizabeth smiled softly, trying to mask her anxiety. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Mommy's just thinking a lot. You know I love you, right?" Ethan nodded, his eyes sleepy. "I love you too, Mommy." As Ethan drifted off to sleep, Elizabeth's mind raced. She had always known that keeping Ethan from Marlon would come back to haunt her, but she had never expected the confrontation to be so intense. Now she had to face the possibility that Marlon would try to take Ethan from her. She couldn't let that happen. Marlon's first legal strike. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth received a summons to appear in court. Marlon was suing for custody of Ethan. When she opened the envelope and read the legal documents, her hands trembled. This was the nightmare she had been dreading. Marlon wasn't just angry. He was coming for her son. She immediately contacted her own lawyer, a family attorney named Amelia Connors, who had been a longtime friend and confidant. "He's going after full custody. He's trying to take Ethan from me." Amelia sighed, glancing over the legal documents. "It's not going to be easy for him, Elizabeth. Courts generally side with the mother, especially in cases like this. You've raised Ethan on your own for 6 years, and from what I can tell, you've done a wonderful job. Marlon can't just waltz in and take him away." Elizabeth wanted to believe Amelia's words, but she knew that Marlon's wealth and influence could tip the scales in his favor. The thought of losing Ethan terrified her, and it reignited a fierce determination in her heart. "I won't let him take Ethan from me." At Sterling Enterprises, Marlon was in full control, directing his legal team with the same intensity he applied to his business ventures. He didn't just want shared custody, he wanted full custody. Ethan deserved to live with him, to have the best opportunities in life, and Marlon was certain that he could provide that better than Elizabeth ever could. But Marlon's lawyer, Jameson, wasn't as confident. "We're going to need more than just your desire to have Ethan live with you. The courts are going to look at what's best for the child, and right now, that's with his mother. We need to prove that you can offer Ethan something that Elizabeth can't." Marlon's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" "We could investigate Elizabeth's life. If we find anything, financial instability, questionable behavior, anything that could suggest she's unfit to raise Ethan, that would help our case." Marlon didn't like the idea of digging into Elizabeth's personal life, but he was desperate. He needed leverage, and if that meant investigating her, so be it. Marlon hadn't met Ethan yet. The boy had no idea who Marlon was, and the court proceedings were still in the early stages. But Marlon couldn't wait any longer. He arranged for a supervised visit, hoping to meet his son for the first time. When the day came, Marlon arrived at the agreed-upon location, a small, child-friendly cafe in Brooklyn. Elizabeth sat across the table from him, tense and on edge. Ethan was at her side, oblivious to the storm brewing between his parents. Marlon's heart pounded as he looked at the boy who was undeniably his son. Ethan had his eyes, his sharp features, but there was something about the boy's innocence that tugged at Marlon in a way he hadn't expected. "Hi, Ethan. I'm a friend of your mommy's." Ethan looked up at him, curious but shy. "Hi." The conversation was awkward at first. Marlon didn't know how to talk to children, especially not his own. But as the minutes passed, he began to loosen up, asking Ethan about his favorite toys, his school, and his friends. Slowly, Ethan warmed to him, laughing at Marlon's attempts to make small talk. Elizabeth watched the interaction with mixed emotions. Seeing Marlon with Ethan was like a punch to the gut. As much as she resented Marlon, she couldn't deny the connection that was forming between him and Ethan. But that didn't change the fact that she feared what Marlon's presence could mean for their future. After the visit, Marlon couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. He had never been the type to feel paternal, but something about the boy awakened a protective instinct in him. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle anymore. He wanted to be a father to Ethan, to make up for the years he had missed. Marlon began arranging more supervised visits, each time growing closer to Ethan. The boy's laughter and curiosity warmed something in Marlon that had long been cold. He started to imagine what it would be like to have Ethan live with him, to be the kind of father he had never thought he would be. But even as his bond with Ethan grew, his anger toward Elizabeth didn't fade. She had kept his son from him, and that betrayal still cut deep. He couldn't forgive her for that, even if part of him still cared for her. As Marlon and Ethan's bond deepened, Elizabeth found herself backed into a corner. The legal battle was taking its toll on her, both emotionally and financially. She knew Marlon had more resources, more connections, and more influence than she could ever hope to match. But what hurt the most was seeing Ethan grow closer to Marlon. It wasn't that she didn't want Ethan to have a relationship with his father. She just didn't trust Marlon to put Ethan's needs before his own ambition. One evening, after another draining day of court preparations, Elizabeth sat on the couch, her head in her hands. Amelia had warned her that Marlon was building a strong case for shared custody, and there was even a chance he could win full custody if the judge was convinced that Marlon's wealth could provide a better life for Ethan. "We need to prepare for the worst, Elizabeth. Marlon is relentless. If he wants something, he'll stop at nothing to get it." Elizabeth's heart sank. She couldn't let Marlon take Ethan from her. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted, and she began to doubt herself. Was she really doing what was best for Ethan? Could she give him the life he deserved? Or was Marlon right? Could he offer Ethan more? Just as Elizabeth was reaching her breaking point, an unexpected ally appeared. Marlon's sister, Sophia, reached out to her. Sophia had always been close to Elizabeth, even after she left Marlon. They hadn't spoken in years, but Sophia had kept tabs on her. And now that the custody battle was in full swing, she felt compelled to help. Sophia met with Elizabeth over coffee, offering her support and advice. "Marlon is my brother, but he can be ruthless when he wants something. I don't agree with what he's doing, and I want to help you. Ethan deserves both of his parents, and I think I can help you make that happen." Elizabeth was surprised by Sophia's offer, but she welcomed the support. With Sophia's help, Elizabeth began to regain her confidence. She wasn't going to back down from this fight. Ethan was her son, and she would do whatever it took to protect him. As the custody battle between Marlon and Elizabeth raged on, Marlon found himself torn between two conflicting emotions. He wanted to punish Elizabeth for keeping Ethan a secret from him, but at the same time, the growing bond he shared with his son softened his resolve. Every moment he spent with Ethan made him question his actions. Was he really doing this for Ethan, or was it his bruised ego pushing him to win this battle? One evening, after a long day at Sterling Enterprises, Marlon sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. His thoughts drifted to the past, to the love he once shared with Elizabeth. Despite all the anger and resentment he harbored, there was still a part of him that missed her, missed the warmth they had once shared. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered to himself, frustration lacing his voice. He was haunted by the memories of their relationship, by the love he had lost and the family he never knew he had. He picked up his phone, contemplating whether to call her. He wanted answers, but deep down, he knew that no explanation could erase the pain of the past 6 years. Putting the phone down, Marlon decided to focus on what mattered most: Ethan. He needed to win this battle, not just for himself, but for his son. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was struggling with her own inner turmoil. The court dates were approaching, and the fear of losing Ethan was becoming unbearable. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and the stress was taking a toll on her health. Every time she looked at Ethan, she was reminded of what was at stake. Losing him wasn't an option. Elizabeth spent hours preparing with her lawyer, Amelia, going over every detail of her life, ensuring that there was nothing Marlon could use against her. But the more they prepared, the more Elizabeth's anxiety grew. Marlon's wealth and power were daunting, and she knew that his resources far outweighed hers. "We have a solid case, Elizabeth. You've been a wonderful mother to Ethan, and the courts will see that. Don't lose hope." But despite Amelia's reassurance, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She knew Marlon's determination, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. She just hoped that the love she had given Ethan over the years would be enough to keep him by her side. While Marlon and Elizabeth were locked in their bitter legal battle, Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the tension between his parents. To him, the visits with Marlon were fun. He liked spending time with his father, who took him on exciting adventures around the city. They visited the zoo, played at the park, and ate ice cream together. Marlon was slowly becoming a central figure in Ethan's life. One afternoon, as they sat in the park after a long day of playing, Ethan looked up at Marlon with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why don't you live with Mommy and me?" Marlon was caught off guard by the question. He hadn't expected Ethan to ask about their living situation, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "It's complicated, buddy, but just know that I love you very much, okay?" Ethan nodded, accepting the answer for now. But Marlon knew that as Ethan got older, the questions would only become more difficult to answer. He had to win this custody battle, not just for himself, but for Ethan's future. The day of the custody hearing finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Marlon sat with his legal team, dressed in a sharp suit, his face a mask of calm. Across the room, Elizabeth sat with Amelia, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped a folder of documents. The weight of the moment was palpable. This was the battle for their son, and both Marlon and Elizabeth were prepared to fight with everything they had. The judge, a stern woman in her 50s, entered the room, and the proceedings began. Marlon's lawyer, Jameson, presented their case first, painting Marlon as a loving father who had been wronged by Elizabeth's decision to hide Ethan from him. He emphasized Marlon's wealth and stability, arguing that Ethan would have more opportunities and a better life living with his father. Jameson also subtly hinted at Elizabeth's decision to keep Ethan a secret as a sign of poor judgment, though he was careful not to outright accuse her of being unfit. Marlon Sterling is a responsible and dedicated father who wants nothing more than to be a part of his son's life. He has the means to provide for Ethan's every need, ensuring that he grows up with the best education, healthcare, and opportunities available. Elizabeth's heart sank as she listened to Jameson's arguments. She knew Marlon could provide a luxurious life for Ethan, but she also knew that material wealth wasn't the most important thing. She had given Ethan love, stability, and a safe, nurturing home. That had to count for something. When it was Elizabeth's turn to present her case, Amelia stood up, her voice steady and firm. She painted a picture of a devoted mother who had raised Ethan on her own, providing him with love, care, and stability. Amelia emphasized the strong bond between mother and son, and how uprooting Ethan from the life he had known would be detrimental to his well-being. Elizabeth Langford has been an exemplary mother to Ethan. She has raised him with love and dedication, providing him with a stable home and a happy childhood. While Mr. Sterling may have the financial means to provide for Ethan, the emotional bond between mother and son cannot be ignored. It is in Ethan's best interest to remain with the parent who has been his primary caregiver for the past 6 years. As Amelia spoke, Elizabeth could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. Her eyes flickered to Marlon, who sat expressionless, listening intently. She knew that no matter how convincing her case was, Marlon's power and influence would weigh heavily on the judge's decision. The highlight of the trial came when Elizabeth was called to the stand. She was asked to recount the years she had spent raising Ethan on her own, detailing the challenges she had faced and the joy she had experienced. Her voice wavered at times, but she spoke with conviction, her love for her son evident in every word. "I never meant to keep Ethan from his father. I was scared, and I didn't know how to handle the situation, but everything I've done has been for Ethan's well-being. He is my entire world, and I can't imagine life without him." Her testimony was heartfelt, and several people in the courtroom were moved by her sincerity. Even Marlon, who had steeled himself against any emotional reaction, found himself affected by her words. He had been so focused on winning that he hadn't fully considered the emotional toll this was taking on Elizabeth. When Marlon took the stand, he presented himself as a father who wanted to make up for lost time. He admitted that he had been hurt by Elizabeth's decision, but he emphasized that his priority was Ethan's future. "I wasn't there for the first 6 years of my son's life, but I'm here now. I want to be a part of his life. I want to give him everything he deserves, and I believe that together, Elizabeth and I can co-parent in a way that's best for Ethan." After days of testimony and legal arguments, the judge was ready to deliver her verdict. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Elizabeth could barely breathe as she waited for the judge to speak, while Marlon sat with his hands folded, his jaw tight with anticipation. The judge began by acknowledging the efforts both parents had made to prove their love and dedication to Ethan. She commended Elizabeth for raising Ethan on her own and recognized Marlon's sincere desire to be involved in his son's life. This is a difficult case, as both parents have demonstrated a deep love for their child. However, the court must make a decision based on what is in the best interest of the child. Elizabeth held her breath. This was it, the moment that would determine her future with Ethan. While the court believes that Mr. Sterling can provide for Ethan's material needs, we also recognize the strong emotional bond between Ethan and his mother. Therefore, I am awarding joint custody, with Ethan remaining primarily in his mother's care. Mr. Sterling will have visitation rights and the opportunity to build a relationship with his son. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't lost Ethan. He would remain with her, just as she had hoped. Tears welled in her eyes as she glanced at Marlon, who sat motionless, processing the judge's decision. Marlon wasn't used to losing. The judge's decision wasn't what he had wanted, but it wasn't a total defeat. He would still have a role in Ethan's life, and that was what mattered most. However, the realization that Ethan would remain primarily with Elizabeth stung. He had hoped to give his son a different life, one filled with all the privileges that came with being a Sterling. After the trial, Marlon approached Elizabeth outside the courtroom. "This isn't over. I'm still going to be a part of Ethan's life." Elizabeth nodded, her heart still racing from the emotional roller coaster of the trial. "I never wanted to keep you out of his life, Marlon. I just wanted to protect him." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Neither of them had truly won, but at least they had a chance to move forward for Ethan's sake. With the trial behind them, Marlon and Elizabeth had to navigate the complex world of co-parenting. It wasn't easy. The wounds from their past still ran deep, and there were moments of tension and frustration. Marlon struggled with the fact that he wasn't the primary parent, while Elizabeth had to adjust to sharing Ethan's time. Ethan, however, was thriving. He loved spending time with both his parents, and the more time Marlon spent with him, the stronger their bond became. Slowly, Marlon began to let go of the bitterness he had been holding on to. Being with Ethan reminded him of what really mattered, and he started to see that winning the custody battle wasn't the most important thing. Being a good father was. As Marlon and Elizabeth spent more time together, co-parenting Ethan, old feelings began to resurface. At first, it was subtle, a glance here, a lingering touch there, but over time, they both started to realize that the love they had once shared hadn't completely disappeared. One evening, after a particularly long day of navigating their new co-parenting schedule, Marlon and Elizabeth sat together on the front porch of Elizabeth's house. Ethan had fallen asleep, and the quiet of the night settled around them. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Elizabeth smiled softly, nodding. "We have. I never thought we'd end up here." There was a pause, and then Marlon spoke again, his voice low and sincere. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth, for everything. I never should have treated you the way I did. I was hurt, but that doesn't excuse what I did." Elizabeth looked at him, her heart softening. She had been waiting for this moment, for the apology she had thought would never come. "I'm sorry too. I should have told you about Ethan from the beginning. I was scared, but I see now that keeping him from you was wrong." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the weight of their shared past began to lift. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, they both felt like they could move forward, together. As weeks passed, Marlon found himself spending more and more time at Elizabeth's house, not just for Ethan, but for Elizabeth herself. His feelings for her, once buried under layers of anger and resentment, had begun to resurface. He found himself looking forward to their late-night conversations, the quiet moments they shared after Ethan had gone to bed. There was a tension between them, something unspoken yet palpable. One evening, as they sat together after putting Ethan to sleep, Marlon couldn't help but notice the way the moonlight reflected off Elizabeth's face, the way her laughter filled the air like music. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly crumbling, but fear still lingered. Could he trust her again after everything that had happened? "You've done an amazing job with Ethan, Elizabeth," he said, his voice softer than usual. "He's a great kid, and that's because of you." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised by the compliment. For so long, Marlon had been cold and distant, driven by his desire for control. But now, there was warmth in his eyes, a gentleness she hadn't seen in years. "Thank you, Marlon. That means a lot coming from you." They locked eyes for a moment, and something shifted between them. The air grew thick with tension, the kind that made both of them painfully aware of how close they were sitting. But neither of them acted on it. The wounds of the past were still too fresh, and both of them knew they weren't ready to take that step yet. Sophia, who had been watching the situation unfold from the sidelines, could see what Marlon and Elizabeth couldn't, or perhaps what they were too afraid to admit. She had noticed the lingering looks, the way Marlon's demeanor softened whenever Elizabeth was around. She had always believed that her brother was still in love with Elizabeth, and now she was certain of it. One afternoon, while visiting Marlon at his office, Sophia decided to confront him about it. "Sophia, so, when are you going to admit that you still have feelings for Elizabeth?" Marlon, caught off guard, frowned at his sister. "What are you talking about?" Sophia rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, please, don't act like you don't know. I've seen the way you look at her. It's obvious you're not over her." Marlon sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to admit that she was right, but deep down, he knew she was. "It's complicated, Sophia. After everything that happened, I don't know if we could ever go back to the way things were. Maybe you don't have to go back. Maybe you just need to move forward." Her words stuck with him long after she left. Moving forward with Elizabeth seemed both terrifying and exciting, but could he risk his heart again? As Marlon and Elizabeth grew closer, it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, tried to tear them apart. That someone was Veronica, a woman from Marlon's past who had always harbored feelings for him. She had heard about Marlon's rekindled relationship with Elizabeth and wasn't happy about it. One day, while Marlon was at work, Veronica showed up at his office unannounced. She was dressed impeccably, her intentions clear. She knew how to play her cards, and she intended to use Marlon's lingering doubts to her advantage. "Marlon, it's been so long. I've missed you," she purred, leaning against his desk with a sly smile. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time with Elizabeth lately. Are you sure that's a good idea?" Marlon, caught off guard by her sudden appearance, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I just think you're setting yourself up for heartbreak again. Elizabeth kept your son from you for 6 years. What's to stop her from hurting you again?" Her words struck a chord in Marlon. He had worked hard to rebuild the fragile trust between him and Elizabeth, but the fear of being betrayed again still lingered in the back of his mind. Veronica's manipulation was subtle, but effective. She left him with a lingering doubt that gnawed at him for days. At the same time, Elizabeth was dealing with her own insecurities. Despite the growing connection between her and Marlon, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too good to be true. She had hurt Marlon deeply in the past, and even though they were in a better place now, she couldn't help but wonder if he could ever truly forgive her. One evening, Marlon was unusually distant. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words were short and clipped. Elizabeth's heart sank. She had sensed this day would come, the day Marlon would pull away, realizing that he couldn't trust her after all. "Marlon, is something wrong? You've been acting strange all day." Marlon hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He didn't want to admit that Veronica's words had gotten to him, but he also couldn't ignore the doubts swirling in his mind. "I don't know, Elizabeth. I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything that happened." Elizabeth's heart shattered at his words. She had been afraid of this, afraid that no matter how much she tried to make things right, the past would always hang over them like a dark cloud. "I understand. I know I hurt you, Marlon, but I've been trying." Marlon cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. Trying isn't always enough. For days, Marlon and Elizabeth barely spoke. The tension between them grew unbearable, and the distance threatened to tear them apart once again. But it wasn't long before Marlon realized the mistake he had made. He had let Veronica's words cloud his judgment, let his fear of being hurt again push Elizabeth away. Sophia, sensing the growing rift between her brother and Elizabeth, stepped in once more. She had no patience for Marlon's stubbornness and wasn't about to let him ruin what they had worked so hard to rebuild. "You're being an idiot, Marlon. Elizabeth has done nothing but try to make things right, and you're letting your fear ruin everything." Marlon glared at his sister, but her words stung because they were true. He had been so focused on protecting himself that he hadn't considered how his actions were affecting Elizabeth. That night, Marlon drove to Elizabeth's house, determined to make things right. When he knocked on the door, Elizabeth opened it, surprise and uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I let my insecurities get the best of me. I shouldn't have doubted you." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, her heart torn between relief and caution. "I've been scared too, Marlon. Scared that you'll never be able to forgive me." Marlon stepped closer, his voice soft but resolute. "I want to forgive you, Elizabeth. I want to move forward, but we have to do it together. No more doubts, no more fears." Elizabeth nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to rebuild their relationship without the shadows of the past hanging over them. With their fears and insecurities laid bare, Marlon and Elizabeth decided to take things slow, rebuilding their trust one step at a time. They focused on co-parenting Ethan, but as time went on, their connection grew stronger. The love that had once been buried under years of pain and resentment slowly began to bloom again. One evening, as they sat on Elizabeth's porch, watching Ethan play in the yard, Marlon reached for Elizabeth's hand. "I love you, Elizabeth. I never stopped loving you." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion. It was the first time in years that Marlon had said those words, and they meant more to her now than they ever had before. "I love you too, Marlon." As the months passed, Marlon and Elizabeth's relationship grew stronger. They had overcome their doubts and fears, and for the first time in years, they were truly happy. Marlon had even started thinking about the future, about the possibility of building a life together, not just as co-parents, but as partners. One evening, Marlon took Elizabeth out to dinner at the same restaurant where they had shared their first date all those years ago. As they sat at the table, reminiscing about the past, Marlon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Elizabeth, we've been through so much together. We've made mistakes, we've hurt each other, but through it all, my love for you has never wavered. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as she nodded, her heart overflowing with joy. "Yes, Marlon. Yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, attended only by close friends and family. Ethan was the ring bearer, beaming with pride as he watched his parents exchange vows. It was a perfect day, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. As they stood together, hand in hand, Marlon and Elizabeth knew that their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced their demons, overcome their fears, and in the end, they had found their way back to each other. Together, they looked forward to the future, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.